Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Michael Richardson, who has come up from Sydney, from UNSW. Michael does fantastic work on sort of emerging technologies, violence, affect, and he looks at these issues in the context of war, security, and surveillance. And he does very, very interdisciplinary work. He works in many ways on international relations themes, but also in media, in literature, in cultural studies, and that's ultimately what sort of good work I think is all about, is to break through the disciplinary boundaries and look at issues without disciplinary kind of things in mind. He is also an exceptionally prolific scholar and writer. He's written a book called Gestures of Testimony, Torture, Trauma, and Affect in Literature with Bloomsbury. He's got lots of fascinating articles on drones and a whole range of different issues. He has just last week published a book, I got it here, on drone aesthetics, war, culture, and ecology, which also features a chapter by our own Catherine Bribblecombe-Fox, who is here. So an absolutely fascinating book, which is available free online. So you have both a copy here, but also it's open access online, and I recommend having a look at it. But today we're here to discuss this book here, also a very new big book with Duke University Press called Nonhuman Witnessing, War, Data, and Ecology After the End of the World. Now, Michael engages a big question, who or what bears witness in politics? And of course, our conventional understanding is that witnessing is a human activity. It's something that we do as people. We witness events, or if we're not there directly as a witness, we see them through media representations, through images, or we witness directly or indirectly. Michael has a very different view. He thinks that witnessing is far more than a human activity. In fact, he draws attention to the problems of seeing witnessing as a purely human kind of act. He has, for instance, done extensive work on drone visuals and showed that drones do a lot more than just convey messages and information. He also makes a point for witnessing and non-human witnessing being actually a transformative kind of activity. But I should hand over to Michael himself, since we have him here, and want to ask him a little bit, maybe to first start off by kind of contextualizing this book a little bit. Tell us why did you end up writing it? How does it fit into your overall work? Just to give us a bit of context to the book. And especially thanks for coming up from Sydney, Michael.
Thank you very much, Roland and Emma, for having me, and Bronte for helping organise today's event, and all of you for being here in person or online. Really appreciate it. I live and work on Gadigal and Bidjigal country in Sydney, and want to extend my respect and recognition of that land and those peoples as well. Which I think is important when we think about things like non-human witnessing and who gets to count as human, and in what ways that intersects with politics and structures of power and violence and so on. The book arose from a question, and it wasn't a question that I asked. I was presenting some early work on thinking about witnessing through drones and the role of affect in that witnessing. Jonas Benz, who's a German legal anthropologist, put his hand up and asked, so is the drone a kind of non-human witness? So I owe the initial framing to Jonas, and that got me thinking a lot. And that happened at an event in Berlin, and a year later I was back in Berlin, and I thought it seemed like a good time and space to try to develop that idea a little bit. And I started to write a paper, and I gave that paper late in my time there in Berlin. And the second question that drove the existence of the book was at the end. Someone said, "Well, so this is a book, right?" and I sort of laughed and said, "I guess now I have to write a book." So that's the sort of jumble of the way the book came to be. But more deeply, it came from a long engagement through my academic career of thinking about how we witness, who witnesses, and what witnessing is composed of. And so at first that question for me was like, was about the limits of speech as a mode of witnessing. And I'm like the visual, of course, is one mode of bearing witness that's beyond speech and written text. So my PhD work and my first book was really about the role of affect and in witnessing and testimony, in particular in relation to trauma and the trauma of torture. But as my kind of work evolved and I kind of started to want to look at things beyond literature and also to at like some different forms of violence beyond that of torture, which is obviously really important, but also I felt like I'd hit my limit of reading and researching and writing about that. And so I was sort of pulled into these questions of the role of the non-human, and it really struck me that like technology was transforming the way we witness the world as a starting point. And the book goes beyond technology, but the technology was transforming how we witness the world, and that was happening not only through the traditional media that we might think of as composing witnessing, like television or photojournalism or news media, etc., or even literature and poetry, but it was happening through technologies that were reshaping how war was being fought. So it struck me that like the starting point was drones, in part because drones are not just inflicting violence, they're not just providing a kind of aerial viewpoint, they're shaping what that viewpoint is, and they're changing the relation that we have to war, but also to the relation that the participants in war have to war. And it seemed to me that like something had to be going on there that was more than just a passive movement of information and a kind of passive and a minor kind of transformation of information that was happening at a technical level. I wanted to ask like was something more going on here, and that led me to this idea of non-human witnessing.
Yeah, I guess to sort of backtrack a little and to sort of think when we were reading your book, and of course in the context of other literature, the non-human is really sort of gaining, it's got gaining quite a moment in particular forms of literature right now. So I guess we wanted to like probe you a little and ask you to sort of go back and sort of say like what do you mean by non-human witnessing? Like what is non-human about it? Particularly, I mean, in relation, I guess I was just thinking your example of drones. So we're always still going to be interpreting the information gained through images, through forms of representation that are then interpreted and so on. So what do you actually mean by non-human witnessing? Is there a boundary between non-human and human witnessing? And I guess if you could tell us a little bit about why, as an extension, why we then need to go ahead and sort of challenge human-centric views of witnessing.
Yep. Thanks. Great question. I guess I'm just sort of sorting through a way to navigate through it. I guess to
start, it would be great to perhaps to contextualize, like what do you mean by non-human?
Yeah, that's what I thought I would
start.
Yeah, that's what I thought I would begin. I mean, I could have.
If I can add one thing, like
yeah, sure.
Why don't we see drones not just as conveying information to us? But why do drones themselves then have this capacity to actually witness rather than us using drones to see what is the inherent capacity of a drone to bear witness that's non-human in itself?
Yeah, I'll try and draw that in. I mean, I think so. The first thing to say is that I think that I could have also called non-human witnessing more than human witnessing, or an other than human witnessing.
Okay.
So like a more than human witnessing might have emphasized more strongly a kind of assemblage of the human and the non-human. But I didn't do that for two reasons. One is that it's too many hyphens. More than human witnessing is just like a lot. But the other the other was that I really did want to be a little provocative with the framing, and to say, like, let's actually kind of push this a little bit. And part of that is I think part of it is that it's sort of a strategic gesture to say, like, can we push the frame of witnessing further from the human, and does that get us somewhere, and is it helpful to do that? I guess, for some context as well, I've really kind of committed to the idea that, like, theory should be propositional, and that theory should ultimately what we want to get to is that the theories that we propose perhaps don't need to sit forever, that they can, like, push us into a space or create a transformation, right? That's the critical in the critical theory, right?
That's the nature of theory.
That's the nature of...
It's always, like, up until a point in time, right? It's like it's never finite. Yeah,
right.
I think I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. So I also, like, I didn't feel like I was trying to propose, like, a kind of universal concept or something, but rather to, like, push us to think, right? In that sort of Deleuzean mode or Marxist mode, I guess. But and so I felt like the human was a constraint on a range of levels. One is that is the question of, like, who gets to count as human, and I think, like, if we we could go into this a bit more later, but if you kind of go back through the literature on witnessing and the role of the witness throughout Western history, I don't know how it figures in other traditions, but in the Western tradition, like, what it means to witness has not been a stable thing at all. Like, who gets to witness has always been deeply political. So, if we roll back to ancient Greece or Rome, the witnessing was a status afforded to particular people, and the giving of testimony was bound up with that status, or with the status of being a slave who could be tortured in order to confess, for instance. So, and then, like, the role of the witness and the figure of the witness and what counts as witnessing transforms through juridical transformations in Europe, for instance, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Who gets to witness is a tool of colonialism in the Americas, for example, where black slaves brought over through the Middle Passage were denied the right to stand in court, and so, like, and in a very real sense were, like, denied under that system of division of identities and peoples, were denied a full standing as human, right? So, like, witnessing, I think, is historically in the West is not an innocent concept, in the sense that it's always had a politics to it that is not necessarily emancipatory or about liberation. It has this very complicated history, and so part of it also was about sort of pushing back against that history and saying, well, like, saying, oh, this is a human activity is also not a straightforward thing to claim. And so part of it was that. And then the other was around, initially at least, around the role of technology, which I think, to me, is far more agential and transformative than the transfer of information. So to take the drone example, for instance, like the kind of iconic drones of drone warfare, the large Reaper or Predator drones, the sensor ball that sits below that and enables it to see at a great distance is immediately digital. So the images and stuff that are capturing is digital. So it's not like imprinting the world in a kind of indexical way like we might get in a photograph with a negative. It is immediately being processed and transformed. That imagery will go through multiple different types of transformations as it moves through a military network into different sort of signal types, for example. So a whole lot of stuff is like happening to the sort of information as it's moving through that network. And at the same time, like a lot of the in the context of the drone, for example, some drone imagery is optical imagery, which we can sort of legibly recognize. But the thermographic or infrared imagery is like only being rendered into hot and cold versions on a screen for us. It doesn't like need to be like that at all, right? So I felt like there is like all these processes at play. And so I wanted to kind of have a way of getting at that. And so it's not, for me, it's not that the non-human witness like excludes the human or people. And that's why I think in some ways More Than Human might have made that a little bit clearer, but at another cost. But it is that there is a lot going on in witnessing itself in the context of, say, drone warfare that is bound up with what that technology, for example, does and how it transforms the witnessing relation. And I wanted a way to kind of talk about that. And so I'll shush in a sec because I'm sure you've got a lot more questions, but it's why I sort of focus on witnessing in the gerund form rather than the witness. So I'm kind of really interested in that like process, right? Witnessing as a process, as something that happens through time. And the book does talk about like non-human witnesses as specific figures, but I try as much as I can to stay in that sort of register of process.
How then is that whole process of witnessing different from other ways through which we convey knowledge? I mean, you used the word witnessing quite specific. You know, you said in courts, in traditions. What does the term do for you and for your book and for the practice of witnessing by distinguishing it from, you know, reading, conveying knowledge, giving a speech? You know, what's the definition of witnessing rather than non-human? In the end, it is non-human and more than human form. Is what makes it a unique form of, for instance, when we witness, do we need to bear witness directly to an event? We or a drone or someone, or can we witness indirectly? And what's the process of it that makes it a political process?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of ways to define witnessing, and there's been many different versions of it. There's an account by John Durham Peters in an article called Witnessing, and it's very well-known article, and he says, you probably read it, Emma, it says, and he says it's about a responsibility to an event. And so, for me, that's this kind of starting point is about this like injunction of a relation that sort of seems to exceed the everyday mode of connection or just mere seeing or mere registering or mere feeling. It sort of seems to have this like extra force to it. One of the things that complicates that, though, is about like, well, when does it become witnessing then? Because if it's about that like responsibility and that sort of intensity of a particular kind of relation that I think it introduces an ethical and political or ethico-political kind of relation, then like, isn't that something that happens after? Potentially, right? Like, when we witness something in the moment, is it witnessing in that time, or is that not so readily separable from the determination that an event has been witnessed in the after? I think that witnessing does happen in the moment. It's not a post-event label that we apply, but it does mean that we need to sort of separate out the experience of witnessing, like a witnessing of an event or a registering of a particular kind of experience, from the act of bearing witness or of giving testimony, and from the testimony itself and from the figure of the witness, right? So we've got like, we're suddenly at like sort of 3 or maybe even 4 things, where we've got the witnessing of an event, we've got the figure of a witness, we've got the act of bearing witness or of giving testimony, and then the witnessing testimony itself. And so the testimony itself might be the recorded image, right, of a particular act. It's recorded with a smartphone, for example. There might be a witness, a human witness alongside that, or in kind of a in assembly or in ensemble with the smartphone. But then there might also be the moment in which that imagery is marshalled in a public context, or put before a court of law, or appears in the news or something, and then becomes part of a larger a larger mode of witnessing. So to me, there's like all of these complexities to witnessing. And then if we look too at like the figure of the witness could be the bystander, they could be the perpetrator, they could be the martyr. There's like many versions of this, and there's many ways to divide it up. And necessarily in the book, or maybe because I'm just like not systematic enough as a thinker, but like in the book, I kind of let some of that messiness stay in there because it's just to me it felt too cumbersome to try and disaggregate that continually through the book. But hence the like emphasis on the gerund, on the witnessing as process, to try and stay with that and the movement from the witnessing as in its occurrence to like how like to the modes of mobilization, but not necessarily getting into the question of like, well, who gets to be the witness then? And I think this, to an extent, does come back to this question of the human and the line between the human and the non-human, where I think like, we can have non-human witnessing, but we can still require humans to be engaged in the political process and to like take those things up and be part of that witnessing. So, like one example might be that like if we from within some indigenous epistemologies or cosmo-epistemologies, there would be there is an idea of agency in country, in land, in animals and so on that far exceeds those in the Western tradition. But that doesn't mean that like humans don't have a role to play as protectors, as people who are in tune with and speaking on behalf of, because like a mountain lasts millions of years, but a human can speak to other people, So part of the push of the book in some ways is to go non-human, but also you're not off the hook, humans.
You just kind of beat me to something that I was going to raise, and that was actually about the transformative and sort of what your conception, I guess, to keep with this messiness, and I'm kind of embracing it here because I quite like it as well. The non-human, the more than human, the process of witnessing, the idea and I think fact that different, say, in Indigenous epistemologies there can be particular agents that cannot speak and so on. I was going to ask, what does your conception of non-human witnessing, more than human witnessing, actually bring? You do, that's a quite explicit point that you're arguing that this opens up a range of transformative political and ethical possibilities for humans. So I was going to ask you about that. You sort of...
No,
you've somewhat started already.
It's a great question, and there's a reason that's primarily discussed in the book in the short coda at the end, because I think it's a really hard question, and
I downloaded that chapter.
And I don't yet have like a full formulation of that, except what I would say is that I don't intend the book to be a kind of injunction on non-human things or environments or technologies or ecologies or many of the other things touched on in the book. It's not an injunction on those things to like do better witnessing and to like, be more agential in relation to humans or anything like that, but rather about like what we humans attend to and the spaces we open up for other ways of knowing and other ways of making political claims. And so in particular, like making the claims that we associate with witnessing, which are about like injunctions of responsibility, which are about like determinations of what matters or what truth is. Now, truth, of course, to me is a very flexible notion in the sense that like truth to who and in what context. So, witnessing produces what are held to be truths, though, often, or at least are held up as possible truths that might be contested and debated. So one of the problems that I arrived at, and I don't know that I really have resolved per se, is that like if that's the case, then are we looking for like a communicative terrain where everything can just speak to everything else, or everything is heard and recognized by everything else? But there's a real problem with that, because then it's like, on what grounds? Like, on what terrain? Like, what is the mode of communication? Like, what's the language of it? Who gets to decide that, right?
I was going to say, like, what happens in that process? I mean, goes wrong. Like, exactly if those questions are decided in ways that silence particular perspectives and so on.
Yeah.
That they were meant to enliven.
Yeah. I mean, so for me, like one the end point of the book, spoilers, is in some ways that, like, if we are to take seriously the notion that there are modes of witnessing that happen outside the human altogether, but that maybe implicate us in various ways, or modes of witnessing that depend upon agencies, experiences, forms of registration or communication or whatever it might be, that are in excess of the human but still involve us, then we have to take seriously the idea that those things might be operating in registers, in modes of knowing and communicating that aren't reducible to the ones that we have ready to hand. And also that the we that I'm throwing around is not a settled thing either, nor is the idea that we're like sharing the same reality in the same way. And I'm not going all like post-truth, alternative facts here, but rather saying, and this is where the end of the subtitle, After the End of the World, is in saying, like, well, actually, like, to me, we have to accept, we need to confront the idea that we are not in a cohesive, single, unitary world where we're all in agreement about things, or even that the world is one thing. And we might all be on the same planet in a material sense, like under the same stars, and so on. But like that world as we know it through our epistemologies and our ontologies and stuff is many, many things. And so part of non-human witnessing, I think, has to be about like respecting that the opacities that have to reside between those different worlds. Because as soon as you say, well, like, we'll connect up the worlds in these ways and all the worlds can communicate with each other, we run into that same problem again, like, on what grounds? And that grounds, to me, or the place that I got to in the book was through great Caribbean theorist of poetry and politics and many other things, Edouard Glissant, who has this idea of the right to opacity. And that opacity is not about, like, shutting off communication, but rather, like, it's a positive force to say there are things that we will not and cannot bridge here and make transparent to one another, but that can be a grounds of politics rather than the end of politics. And I think that, to me, is really important. And it, like, it makes me very uncomfortable with ideas around transparency and things like that, for example. Like, not that I'm against transparency per se, but, like, there's I think when we start to think that way, it opens up a bunch of problems for some of the things that we think of as good in global politics or in warfare or in courtrooms or in culture or whatever. And I would like to see us be more okay with those opacities and more okay with knowledges that we can't reduce to one another or can't reconcile with one another.
Look, Emma and I had a whole bunch of questions left, but because we want to make sure people here in the room and online have a chance to come in as well, I might sort of limit it to one quick final question. I did want to talk about how all that links in terms of your previous work on affect and Iran by Sumi. But given this is a visual politics program, I want to ask a final, very brief question on the visual dimensions of witnessing. And my colleague and collaborator, the late Alex Stanchev, sort of has written extensively on how the artist as witness provides very unique insights into the world today, into past worlds. And so to what extent is non-human witnessing a visual phenomena, and how does that work out? So maybe we do that as a final question, and then we'll bring everyone else in for
Great.
for comments and questions.
Yeah, I mean, I know Alex Danchev's work a bit on that topic, and it's wonderful. The book deals a lot with aesthetic works and with art, including a little from Catherine. But that's because to me, like art, whether visual or not, provides this like way into thinking otherwise and to experiencing otherwise, where we don't demand the same things of it, and it opens up like other modes of relation, other modes of sensing and sense making, which is why I think the aesthetic is so important. And art is not the only place where aesthetics happens, of course, but it is a place where aesthetics is like really explored, often deliberately, and where we kind of surface these alternative ways of thinking and relating and experiencing and feeling. So a lot of the examples in the book are quite visual. And I think that's and you know, the drone we think of as a primarily visual technology, although I'm not so sure about that. But there is a really strong visual element. But I think the visual, and I think that's because the visual enables us to step outside the determinacy that we expect of language. Language is not determinate, but like visual seems to be a bit more open in that respect and opens up these like other ways of engaging that don't tie so directly to a particular semantic content or informational content. So the visual appears a lot in the book for that reason, and I do think that like I think that visuality is really important in this question of non-human witnessing. But I also think, you know, that we need to particularly there's lots of ways in which we need to kind of push the visual, but I'm thinking right now quite a bit about the modes of knowing and experiencing and so on that we might extract from things like artificial intelligence, where even the artificial intelligence technologies that are seemingly visual in what they give us are not, in the sense that, like, you know, the image recognition software that might be in a drone, to carry that example through, isn't visual. Like it doesn't see the image in any meaningful way, and in fact the idea that it is like vision is a bit of a misnomer, and it's a little bit like, you know, Catherine in her work talks about like censoring rather than sensing, to like emphasize this difference between machinic experience. And so like for me, like visual is really important, but we also need to kind of track the underside of the visual, or the way the visual like comes into contact with other types of technologies that are seemingly visual and yet are operating on a different political ground. So for example, like that artificial intelligence image recognition or machine vision stuff, like it's not visual, like the way a basic image recognition algorithm works. Apologies for anyone who's like better on this stuff than me, but the way it works, like a convolutional neural network, like in facial recognition or whatever, it basically like slides across a numerical array that represents the images that we see on a computer, and it uses that sliding across to identify elements within the image, which it mostly understands through the edges of those elements. So where are the things that are unlike the things that are here, and it produces like an account of that image and provides us with like a reading of it or a viewing of it that might say like, you know, I know this is an image of Samid because I can recognize that against other ones, but it doesn't know that, it doesn't see it, it's not visual in that same way. And so my collaborators Anna Munster and Adrian Mackenzie have this fantastic paper about invisual perception, where they sort of argue that there's a kind of invisuality to these types of technologies that like really confronts the visual, and that like alongside the abundance of images that we're surrounded by, like this invisual, where like it is image, but what is happening is a different mode of perception in relation to the image, is really important to understand, because something quite profoundly different is going on. And to me, that like I draw on that work a bit in one of the chapters in the book, but to me that sort of is a good way of getting to where we have to kind of expand, but also kind of get underneath and take apart some of the aspects of visuality in our technologized moment right now.